I certainly want to take the opportunity to thank Rose and Robe for their continued and longitudinal impact through this structured learning activity known as a conference. And we really missed it during the pandemic. For those of you who do not know me, I will tell you a little bit about myself, not that it's all that important, but I am Clifton Kennon. I am a very proud rural American, grew up in rural North Carolina, and I live rural today because I'm committed to rural health and rural community self-determination. I grew up in a Blacktopia. I grew up my entire life seeing Black professionals. We've had Black judges, attorneys, sheriffs, congresspeople for my entire life. And I was taught by HBCU educated teachers for every grade of my life through becoming a senior in high school. I went to HBCU. My mother went to HBCU. My grandmother went to HBCU. And their ancestors went to HBCU. And perhaps my greatest aspiration for my 5-year-old, if she decides to pursue higher education, would be that she would recognize the tremendous value and impact of going to HBCU also. That being said, I am a nurse by training. I have a doctorate degree in nursing, and I've done postdoc training in phenomenology, particularly qualitative research. But I may be one of the only people that you will ever meet that can say they have done lactation their entire career. And I have been doing breastfeeding since I was 18 years old. I will be 36 next year, and I've seen a lot of things in these 18 years. The very first breastfeeding conference I went to, I entered the room in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I came to the end of the table, and white women began to pass their trash to the end of the table. Some of those same women pay me quite a bit of money to speak at their conferences now. So how the tables turn. When I met Mama Bug and the entourage that was Rose, I had only ever met one other Black lactation professional. And that was a nurse by the name of Sharon at Duke, who taught me induced lactation and told me I was going to become an IBCLC, of which I did at the age of 22. That being said, I want to talk today about something that is really bothering me, and I think it's bothering a lot of people. And that is the way we are interacting with each other and our organizations along the generational spectrum. See, my clinical lactation career has been largely around helping people manage low supply and induced lactation. For years, I worked in clinic, and I enjoyed seeing patients, and I did home visits for many years. I, like many young African Americans, Latinx, American Indians, got involved in board work and service in organizations, and we essentially lost out on clinical practice because you can't be all things to all people. During the pandemic, I began to get calls about people who were falling through the cracks and systems that we had worked to fix for the last 10 to 15 years. Living on a beautiful farm in Lancaster County as the only African American on my entire street that owns my farm property, I sort of live in my own utopia. So snow was falling the winter that we had the variant that caused so much harm. And I was making hot chocolate in the crock pot and listening to Mahalia Jackson, and I had built the fire. The dogs began to bark, and like every good Southern man, I got my shotgun. And listen, I'm a rural American, it is what it is. People come to your house at night, you have your shotgun, okay? That's what you do. And I looked out in the snow, and I saw a young Hispanic family freezing at my door with a small baby, saying, "People say you can help with breastfeeding. We have no money for formula. We need help." And I remember climbing up to my third floor and dusting off a scale that I had never planned to use again. I remember digging breast pumps out of my closet and coming face to face with, this is why we all got started. And despite the hundreds of speeches that I had given, despite books I had written in, policies and procedures that I've written all over the world, we found ourselves in a situation during COVID where a significant portion of the lactation space that we had made advances in, we lost gains in almost overnight. A state like Pennsylvania, where potentially the brightest minds of lactation exist in our country, was now a state where people could not get lactation care in facilities, and all of the people that were doing home visits could no longer afford to do home visits because they weren't getting paid, they didn't have personal protective equipment, and no one was doing anything about it. And here in the snow, a family through word of mouth knocked on my door. And since that day, I have stepped away from boards, and I have my scrubs on, and I'm seeing black and brown people who fell through the cracks and are still falling through the cracks today, and I refuse to accept that. And that's why I want to talk about why we must get back to handling business in our organizations. I want to talk to you today as a millennial, and a very proud millennial. I believe my generation is an amazing generation, and we, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, I don't care, write it on the evaluation, whatever. The millennial generation is responsible for changing the narrative as it relates to breastfeeding. Not because we were the practitioners, we were the patients, okay? The millennials stepped up and begin to normalize breastfeeding, and we see great things coming out of the next generation. But they don't deserve all the credit. The objectives for the presentation today are very simple. We are going to explore how to create intergenerational harmony. Period. Andrea, for recording purposes, we have some others on paper. I want to give a shout out today to 4 generations. In the lactation space, there are 4 generations that are coexisting. And for a long time, we were led to believe that we were going to live in a 3-generation in the workplace society. That did not come to be. And the reason it didn't come to be is because there is essentially 2 sets of baby boomers. There's the first set and the second set, who are very much alike, but also very much different. The lactation space has been held together by the altruistic motivation of people that can do significant portions of volunteer work. The baby boomers that have retired have a very significant place because they now have money and they can do continued volunteer work, because the 3 other generations seem to not have money and not be able to do as much volunteer work without getting paid. Does this sound right? Okay. I want to make that clear. So even though we thought people were retiring, they have not retired out of the lactation space. How many baby boomers are in here if you were born maybe up to 1965? Okay. If you have lived lactation in the last 10 years, that used to be the majority of the hands that went up. And we have seen that shift over the last 5 years to being rooms more with Generation X and Generation Y. So our baby boomers are largely retired or retiring, or, as my friend Jaretha would say, working as desired. Talk about privilege, goals, right? Yeah, I'm working as I desire to. Depends on how I feel that day. I consider our baby boomers to be the matriarchs of the lactation movement. They were raised by the veterans or the traditionalists, so their parents would have lived the Depression. Many of them were raised with some post-war prosperity. Not that prosperity in African American or Hispanic indigenous communities ever looked exactly like prosperity in dominant culture communities, but for what it was worth. They also lived the civil rights movement and lived Jim Crow. And this is where I'm getting a little upset, because we've got entitled young people that are telling the people that lived the civil rights movement about civil rights. And they're not always being real nice about it. We're going to talk about that. The Generation X is the smallest generation that has been recorded in our lifetime. The generation that birthed them, this would have been the start of where we had contraception. We would have had post-war prosperity, and we would have had, people that wanted smaller families. In African American communities, many of these people, the rural areas, lived with 7 or 8 brothers and sisters in very small houses. And the Generation X grew up with the 3-bedroom, 2-bath dream house. That was the HGTV dream. If you had a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, that was something. My folks want 5 bedrooms and 4 baths and 1 person in the house. And then they wanted to find somebody to complain about because they got to clean it. Right? That was me. The Generation Y, or the millennials, was called the second baby boom. It was the largest generation recorded. Not anymore. The Generation Z, largely thanks to the African continent, is the largest generation in the world. The millennials created social media. Mark Zuckerberg, those were millennials. The millennials also remember the time without the internet. And I think a lot of people forget that, but there was a time where we didn't have the internet. Perhaps the greatest impact media-wise for millennials was we grew up when there was an abundance of black shows on TV that highlighted African Americans out of poverty. Whether it was the Cosbys or whether it was the Fresh Prince, whether it was Family Matters, etc. And that was really important because representation matters. And then we have the Generation Z, which in a lot of cases became the younger brothers and sisters of the last little bit of millennials, right? So in this unique case, we have 2 large generations that have kind of been raised together. We didn't really have that between the Gen Xers and the Ys, but we have Ys being raised with Zs because family planning and spacing of pregnancy, people have got much more autonomy around. So you have career mothers who had babies and then spaced them out, and you ended up with generations. So that's my family. I have a Gen Z brother who I sometimes wonder if we were raised in the same house. Because I don't remember, being able to put dishes in the dishwasher without essentially washing them first. All right. The Generation Z, we know them as our COVID professionals. These are the generations that made it sexy to be smart and not go to college the first year. What did he call it? The gap years. The Obamas helped us with that. We're taking gap years. So I've got younger siblings, and I'm like, well, is it year or is it like the S in parentheses, years? Help me understand. I'm trying to figure out what the gap is. All right. Where are my Generation Xers? They're here. So the Generation Xers, and folks, don't write this on the evaluation. This is not a science. So you may disagree, but do not write it and don't call me about it. You can disagree. The Gen Xers, through about 1980. Yeah, you see more of them than you once did. They were the smallest generation. The Gen Xers are responsible for bringing to us, they coined the term work-life balance. What we have now is a little different than what they were asking for, but they were asking for 2 weeks of paid vacation in a 3-bedroom, 2-house. The millennials, where are my millennials? Every other week vacation. Listen, I'll talk about my folks. Half days, short days, middle of the day. Look, I told my grandmother I was on a mental health day, and she looked at me and she basically almost cursed and was like, "What the hell is that?" Well, you wake up and you just don't feel like you have enough mental space to go. And she was like, "Well, nothing would have ever got done in my generation because we didn't have enough mental space to go hardly ever." Where are my Generation Z? And this is problematic. And the reason we got them. However, this is our childbearing population, right? So we do all this talk about engaging the community, but for those of us that are doing lactation, our primary stakeholders, or a large group of them, is going to be the Gen Z. So they've got to be represented in more than just the patient category. And excuse me, I know I'm using the wrong term. What are we calling the people we interact with today? Clients, is that the term? Okay. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. I don't know what you can say. And that's what we want to talk about today is political correctness that's killing the cause. Write about it on the evaluation if you disagree. Now, what we know from the lactation, I'm going to run through this really quickly. So I've given you just some broad oversights of what the generations experience. In the lactation world, the baby boomers were largely not breastfed. But they would have known about breastfeeding because their parents would have been breastfed. And in rural communities and places where there was lack of resources and so forth, you did still see some breastfeeding. Baby boomers would have remembered the sort of influx of La Leche League type conversations if you were engaged in the hospital. What people do not realize is that the professionalization of nursing for Black people did not happen until about the mid-1950s. That's right. That's when we had professional nursing schools. They would have started at Dillard, Tuskegee, FAMU, and then we would have came up to the grand Winston-Salem State University and North Carolina A&T. And I think that's important because we've had Black physicians at the professional level for much longer than we've had Black nurses. The other thing that nobody talks about is even when we did have Black nurses, they were kept out of maternity wards unless they worked in all Black hospitals. I grew up in a rural community, and the primary birthing population are Blacks and Hispanics. I was the second Black nurse to ever work there, and today there are no Black nurses and no white patients. And this is a problem that no one is talking about, and that is who is going to be on the front lines. The Generation Xers became the second generation of lactation professionals. Lactation as a professional career or as a study, a discipline, whatever you want to call it, I don't know the correct word. That was created by the baby boomers. The Generation Xers were your essential first generation of lactation consultants that ever came up, that went through any type of training. The millennials led the movement to normalize breastfeeding. These were the people that you saw on the posters. These were the people that were feeding their babies at graduation, cursing people out on YouTube. That was the millennials. And then the Generation Z, for all intents and purposes, have seen breastfeeding their entire life, right? And that's a major shift when you think about my generation who saw breastfeeding shift when I was about 15 to my younger brother's generation that walks in places and sees people breastfeed and it's just normal, right? Thank you all for the work that went into making that a reality. We have a generation that has normalized breastfeeding and it didn't just happen. But we have significant challenges that we face. Now, I don't know about you, but there was a time where there were more breastfeeding organizations being created than I think there were actual people. And we couldn't keep up with all of them. It wasn't clear what they all did, but everybody was starting an organization because it seemed like the cool thing to do. We know that many of those organizations did not survive the pandemic. Some of them did not ever get footing because as the movement for breastfeeding happened and as people of color came into the space, we saw the money slowly decline. As people of color came in, the green things declined, okay? But we do have thriving organizations that are still struggling to make it. Some are doing better than others, but some of this struggle can be alleviated if we remove our own personal issues out of the struggles that we're having. We have communities that are still being failed. If you thought we had a strong breastfeeding infrastructure, it was almost decimated during the pandemic. For all the years that we've talked about community milk sharing and we've talked about supporting the community, community workers in many communities vanished in the middle of the night during the pandemic. In addition to that, we have continued issues, endless conversations around role delineation, who can do what, when they can do it, where they can do it, who they can bring with them to do it, while the patients are continually being failed. Not to mention that people that have been doing the work for a long time are suffering from compassion fatigue and burnout. And there are people in this room and in many other rooms that have done this work largely from their own personal finances and never got remunerated at all. Well, when gas became over $5 a gallon, when fuel oil was $1,000 a tank, I saw people that were motivated and wanted to do the work, but just simply could not afford to. And it came down to being a doula or a community-based lactation professional, making sure my children have heat. And you know what? The people that decided that they were going to make sure their children had heat, they are just as much heroes as the people that continued. And I want to make that clear. And then I have seen people just left, like they just don't do lactation anymore. You know, I contacted someone that I used to see at this conference. It's like, where are you? You know, I don't do breastfeeding. I'm doing other stuff now. Like I wasn't getting paid. I needed to pay off my student loans, etc. We continue to see the same issues: racism, gentrification, sustained levels of poverty that inflation have made more of a reality. And then we have political correctness that is literally just killing us from the inside out, right? So let's talk about it. We're going to spend the last 15 minutes talking about how we can center the culture where if my grandmother made a mistake and she called me by another grandson's name, I could not sit her down and tell her how bad of a person she was. Right? But this is the stuff that we have going on today in our organizations, and I'm seeing people that have a lot to give being alienated from spaces of which we need them in. And I see this happening largely along generational lines. So, anybody remember the party lines, millennials? Millennials? I grew up in a rural community, and I remember when the party lines went away. I also remember when you could sit out and hear what people were talking about on the party line, because I had a grandmother who was nosy, and she did it for fun. So when I got on the party line to talk to people about this topic, when Mama Bug asked me to do it, I got some of their stories, and I want you to listen to what people are saying. And some of these are not breastfeeding organizations, just people that are working community organizations. I believe it's my role to be the mediator between the older people and the younger generations because I see it from both sides. I don't always know which side to take, but why should I have to take a side at all? I was invited to a community event, and I went. I wore the same clothes that I wore everywhere else. And the stares and looks that I got from people who were clearly overdressed for any meeting was just a put off. Yeah, no thanks. I just don't know what to do with this new generation.
I have literally been cussed out by young people for calling them young lady, and they told me I had caused them harm by misgendering them. I was then called out via the microphone for doing this, and I didn't mean any harm. From now on, I will not be saying anything because the policing tone of these meetings and conferences is too risky for me. What these entitled young people didn't even know was that I had given money to sponsor some of them to come to this event. What the hell is the world coming to? How can we effectively engage the community if all we do is sit behind a screen? I feel no connection with people in my organization at all, so I have just checked out. Because when I say anything about meeting in person, I am told that I am not considering a whole list of things around safety. But some of these same people I see at the store, I see them on vacation, but you can't argue with this generation because they know more than everyone else. Meetings are far too long. I spend more time talking out what I want to say in an effort to not offend people than what it should ever take. I made the mistake one time of referring to someone as Spanish culture, and I endured a lecture that was so disrespectful I left the room. Who the hell do these people think they are that they can just speak to me this way? It was clearly a mistake. Do I now get to call out everyone's mistakes in public areas? What happened to talking to people in private? And why are people putting this on Facebook? I've been canceled. I am now irrelevant. I gave so much of my life to this organization. I got on the wrong side of a group of activists, or shall I say, entitled young folks, and now I'm nothing. When did our culture lose grace and forgiveness? How do you cancel me because I disagree with you? Do all black folks have to feel the exact same about everything? I understand that you can volunteer and do all this work for free. However, I can't. I'm sorry that you don't see that as commitment because you can't see your own privilege. These are epithets that came from across the generations that really point to really simple misunderstandings as far as I'm concerned. Now, I won't tell you my personal opinions about some of these things, but I do agree meetings are too long and cancel culture has gotten out of hand. Okay? So what are we going to do? I think the first thing we have to do is very simple. Everybody has to take responsibility for being both the problem and the solution, right? I've had a few outcasts at a meeting at the microphone before. As I got a little older, lost a bit of hair, I may not do it the exact same way that I did it before. I think millennials have learned that we can't just blow up every conference we go to, because that was happening at one time. We got the Gen Zs blowing it up before they get there and then tearing it apart and walking out and then asking people to pay for it. And then we got our baby boomers that are like, look, I'm coming, but I'm sitting in the corner because I'm not getting caught up with these folks because they're not going to make me feel bad. I think we have to, in every organization, understand what our purpose is. I help a lot of organizations, and I go to breastfeeding meetings, and I leave not actually understanding if these people are working on breastfeeding or not. I've said this for years. An organization may not take on every social issue that exists around them, okay? So if I'm having a breastfeeding meeting and I'm talking about helping young black and brown people get breast pumps, you don't get to take over my meeting and talk about something that is not directly related to that. And there's too much of that that's going on. People are coming into spaces and attempting to leverage their personal causes at the organization level, and that does not work long term. And this is why a lot of startups did not succeed. But people don't want to say that, but that's why. We've got to take stock of what our own cultural practices are. And I believe in liberation, right? I bring my culture to the table and you do too. And my culture says you don't wear white shoes after Labor Day. But I may not stand up at the podium and call people out if they decide to wear white shoes after Labor Day. And we've got some of that kind of stuff going on. That being said, with my culture comes baggage. With your culture comes baggage, right? So when I come into a space, I bring the things that are normal to me. I cannot imagine. I'll talk to Dr. Young all day, and we're cool as can be. I could not imagine using profanity with Dr. Young. Dr. Long, don't know. And I thought that's how everyone felt. But I'm learning there are children who interact with their parents and people in their community, and they use profanity. Now, I can't wrap my arms around that, but if we're going to invite everybody to the table, we got to invite everybody to the table. And in some cases, this is normal. This is the first time I've ever given a speech in my life without having on a suit. You wear a suit when you're giving a speech. But guess what? The world is changing. And if we want the community to be at the table, the community gets to bring their authentic self. And they don't get to be policed by the people that are there trying to make everybody do what they think is right. So millennials are sort of in the middle, right? We've worked with the older people who have brought us up and given us opportunity. But we also have seen our younger brothers and sisters who have done tremendous things and maybe are more misunderstood than understood. Some of which I think is their fault. But we've talked largely in dominant culture settings about power shifting. That conversation is relevant in our settings too. And power shifting and transforming who is in leadership roles needs to move a bit quicker, even in our black and brown spaces. Too often what happens is the people who start the organization stay in power in that organization by default because they are the only ones that can hold it together. And we've got to change that immediately. So if you have a board of directors, you should have people from every generation on it. And someone says, well, you need skills to be on a board. That's exactly right. But you also need perspective to refine skill. And if our primary population that's breastfeeding is Gen Z, you cannot have organizations where they're not represented, whether or not they use profanity in meetings or not. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is we have talked a lot about healing, and we've talked a lot about going to therapy and intervention. If you've been doing this work as a community-based organization for more than a year, I am going to recommend not doing so. What are these things called where you write the letters and people introduce themselves and they tell you their letters and you're supposed to know about them? What is that called? The test that they give in these organizations, waste of the taxpayers' money. The personality test. Has anybody ever thought about doing group therapy with their colleagues? I am advocating in this season group therapy for people that have been doing this type of work as a way to re-energize and to move their organizations forward. Many organizations have the vision, but they've lost sight of it because of everything that's happened. So my presentation is simple to you today. Take stock of why we're really here and bring people together with that being the focus, recognizing that you will need to give, you will need to take. You will hurt people, people will hurt you. But as organizations, the communities are depending on us to do the work. And in many cases, we are beginning to fail communities again because our processes are getting in the way of us doing intervention. The last thing that I want to say before I sit down today is, as an African American and someone who grew up in a rural community, every opportunity that you have to show someone
who you are and who they may be, you need to take it. When I was in the 4th grade, my HBCU educated teacher brought a black scientist from the University of North Carolina. And he looked at me as an amazing, beautiful black man in a suit with the Windsor knot tied perfectly. And he said, "Young man, you can be a scientist." And I became a scientist. And I've been able to influence breastfeeding all over the world. But I would have never dreamed that being a scientist for a young man who grew up in a town where a caution light was the only thing that illuminated the night was a reality. Last year, Dr. Bug, myself, and Dr. Asiadu received the highest honors given to nurses in the United States. And to our knowledge, we are the only people to be inducted with community-based breastfeeding as our practice and focus area. So keep on keeping on. Love every generation. Love your community. And let's get our focus back to the work and not let political correctness and the things that are dominating dominant culture circles take away things that keep us bonded together. Thank you so much.